Chapter 1 Guardian of the Frontier, First Part. At the onset of autumn in the year 7000 by noble reckoning, two fears plagued the village of Ardos. One was the presence of the OSB, outer space beings that had been waging war against Ardos's rulers, the nobility, for over 100 years. The other was the imminent visit from their overlord and overseer of the northern frontier sector, Greylancer. Were this a different sector or an inspection by a local overseer, the villagers would not have much cause to fret. An overseer's appearance in a human habitat zone was exactly that, a ceremonious procession of auto vassals flanking a G-coffin, paraded down the street, all accompanied by the solemn music of a robotic band. Nary a soul believed that an inspector, much less a lord, was acting as the menacing eye of the nobility from inside the coffin, as decreed in the missive from the capital. But the overlord of the northern frontier sector would surely come. For over 3,000 years, the greater noble Greylancer had ruled over this sector, becoming a legend in his lifetime. His very appearance inspired awe in his subjects. But the villagers were shaken by a peculiar kind of confusion and anxiety. As the appointed time approached, they glanced up at the source of their confusion, the sky itself. White clouds frolicked in the blue sky like kittens. Not even a shadow of OSB aircraft, rumored to have come from the endless void to engage the nobility night and day in a fierce aerial battle, passed overhead. No, it was daylight. Lord Greylancer was expected to arrive at high noon, in 2 minutes' time, but just how was a noble, a vampire, capable of visiting this sun-drenched village? Are you sure this isn't some sham, Chief? The sub-chief, one of 10 villagers standing at the north entrance, asked Chief Lonzi. I know he's a greater noble and all, but in the middle of the day, how do you reckon he'll get here, and bringing with him only one retainer? I won't pretend to understand the ways of the nobility, of all the villages in the frontier, coming to a speck of dust such as this. I suppose you and I will go to our graves never knowing. But I heard he'd been here once before, when you were a boy. The wrinkled chief pried open his fissured eyes and blinked. You heard right. I was 4. My mother and father forbade me, but I cracked open the window and snuck a peek at the path in front of my house. I heard the sound of hooves clopping from a distance, and soon enough, this towering shadow straddling a gargantuan horse passed before my eyes. It felt as if a ghostly presence blew in through the window. I couldn't sleep a lick that night. That was the noble Greylancer. But that was at night, wasn't it? Yeah. A brilliant moon shone down over the village. He aims to come in broad daylight this time. Did vampires evolve somehow when we weren't looking? Who knows what the nobility are up to? At least he doesn't need any more than 3 delegates to greet his arrival. The rumor is that the southern and eastern overlords demand a welcome parade, costing villages a year's revenue. Nothing for you to be happy about. The sub-chief bit a bent finger. All I've heard is how cruel and cold-blooded his lordship is, like a messenger from hell. And he's coming to this tiny village in the shining sun. I tell you, Chief, this is an omen, a sign of bad things to come, something beyond our imagination. Shh. The village treasurer tensed, his eyes fixed on a point in the distance. I hear hooves. He's coming. The lingering villagers disappeared at once, as if scattered by an ominous black wind. Only 4 remained. The chief, sub-chief treasurer, and a red-headed woman. Though a hard life had aged her, She was still in her early 30s. She was the chief's wife. It was obvious by the way her husband eyed her like a nuisance that her presence was unwelcome. After arguing with her husband much of the morning, she had joined the welcome delegation against his wishes, and when two shadows on horseback appeared in the path stretching down the miasma-draped wasteland, the look on the woman's face resembled one of enchantment, unlike the terror-stricken faces of the men next to her. One by one, the faces vanished from windows and doors of mud-packed houses made of wood and stone. The threadbare curtains were drawn, though appearing to be shrouded by a dark mist from afar. The figure halting the black cybernetic horse before them was blurred by a navy and gold-tinged haze. Navy was the color of his cape, gold the color of the embroidery on his coat. "We've been expecting you. I'm Lonzi, chief of Arda's village. This is Sub-Chief Stao, and the village treasurer Shizhong. Pardon the trouble. I'm Greylancer." The voice from atop the horse sounded terribly distant, but packed enough force to send chills up the spines of the four villagers. Long, shiny black hair, a rugged face as if the bones underneath were forged from steel, a neck thick enough to support that weight, thick brows, tall nose, his tightly drawn lips red like blood. One bellow from those lips might fell birds in flight. As well, his body appeared as if flesh and skin were stretched over a steel frame. His eyes were as blue and deep as the ocean, but would no doubt turn as red as his lips at the first whiff of blood. Greylancer jerked his chin toward the mounted figure behind him and said, "My retainer, Grosbeck." The man, bowing with his hand still gripping the reins, was narrow-chested and neither as tall nor broad around the shoulders as his master. Chief Lonzi imagined his delicate head popping off with a flick of his master's finger and blowing away into the horizon with a single breath. The mechanized armor beneath his cape appeared utterly useless, or rather, in eternal disrepair. Thin, slight eyebrows, half-lidded eyes that appeared shut, eyes like those of a dead fish, and finally a look of agony as if he'd taken his last gasp. Despite the sword hanging at his side and the laser gun affixed to his right forearm, he hardly seemed able to handle them. No doubt they were broken, anyway. Nevertheless, the expression that Greylancer directed at his only companion was one of complete trust. "Anything?" Greylancer asked Grosbeck. The villagers stared at one another in confusion. Though different than the other villages, inevitable, I'm afraid. Grosbeck rubbed the base of his nose, in the manner of the drug addicts in the village. "Any one? I cannot say for certain. No one within earshot." "Good," said the voice of steel. "Whatever they might feel for the nobility cannot be helped." "Yes, my lord." The man with the voice and body of an invalid pinched his nose harder. When Greylancer dismounted his horse, the villagers heard the earth rumble. A phantom sound, of course, but no wonder. The noble stood nearly 2 meters tall. Greylancer's deep blue eyes paused on the woman and reflected a smile before turning to the chief. "Do you find it strange to see us walking in the sun?" he asked. "Why, no." "You needn't hide your shock. At present, only Grosbeck here and I are capable of doing so." "My lord," said the chief, dropping his eyes in deference. Greylancer's gaze reverted to the woman. A rare surprise seeing a woman to greet our arrival. "Begging your pardon," said the chief. "This is my wife. My name is Misha." The woman bowed, perhaps to conceal the forlorn look on her face. "Do vampires not frighten you?" "Why, not in the least." "Well, now." Greylancer smiled faintly. All like incisors peered out from lips that were blanched for a vampire. Quite a woman, but rest assured, we'll not stay long. We've been traveling this sector, but this village was not one of our planned stops. We've come because a surveillance satellite reported something falling from the sky in this area. Though the villagers had heard of the existence of several dozen surveillance satellites floating on the outer edges of the atmosphere, they were ignorant of the particulars of their use. Nevertheless, it was enough to fill the village chief and the others with apprehension. Something falling from the sky. The overlord had ridden his horse to investigate this something himself, in all likelihood to dispose of it. Chief Lonzi swallowed hard. Greylancer towered over him like a giant, unarmed. He carried neither lance nor bow nor sword. No one doubted his ability to crush any enemy regardless. "Are you speaking of the OSB?" the chief asked, fearing he would incur the overlord's wrath for speaking out of turn. But Greylancer smiled faintly a second time. "Indeed," he answered. "You know well. A worthy subject. Any ideas?" "Are you speaking of the OSB?" the chief asked, fearing he would incur the overlord's wrath for speaking out of turn. But Greylancer smiled faintly a second time. "Indeed," he answered. "You know well. A worthy subject. Any ideas?" First part end.